Hi, welcome to Orgone Continuum TV number 7, and this month we're going to be discussing my first published Orgone and consciousness paper at psychorgone.com, which is a relatively new Orgone journal. There's a handful of Orgone journals. The first one after Reich passed away. Reich had 5 or 6 different titles, I think, for his own journals. The last one being I can't remember now. I'll have to go and look it up. Anyway, the first one after Reich's, it will come back to me. The first one after Reich's passing was the Ergonomic Functionalism, which was a British journal, strangely enough. Not a heck of a lot has gone on in orgonomy in Britain, but the very first journal after Reich passed away was in Britain, published in Nottingham by a couple called Paul and Jean Ritter. Anyway, after that, there was the next one to start up was I'm going to have to nip to my library and grab a couple of things, unless I can remember it. No, I'm going to have to. Right, I won't be a sec. Right, I'm back. Right. Yeah. Okie dokie. So the first one was a very rare journal called Ergonomic Functionalism, which was hand printed in a house in Nottingham, and eventually moved to the Ritters moved to Australia. So the full archive of it is in Australia. I've got a couple of original copies. Then the next journal after that, so these are all post 1957 after Reich died. The next journal was the Creative Process, which became the Radix Institute. Was it Charles Kelly who printed it? I'm not very on the ball today, I'm afraid. Yeah, Charles Kelly, Kelley. And apologies for the lateness of this month's video. I was away to visiting a research friend at the beginning of this month, and then when I got back, I had my osteopathy treatment, and that absolutely waxed me out for a whole day. So so I wasn't able to do that till now. And then I've reminded myself what was the last journal that Reich printed, which was the Orgone Energy Bulletin. Or the Orgone Bulletin. And the last book that Reich published was Contact with Space, which is just been republished by the Wilhelm Reich Museum, or the Wilhelm Reich Infant Trust Foundation as its longer name. Anyway, so we're going through a history of the post-Reich journals. So then, after the Creative Process, the Journal of Orgonomy got set up by a group of psychiatrists and sort of orgone therapists, and mainly based around New York. That had a lot of biophysical work in the first few decades, and then it tended more towards psychotherapeutic angles in more recent years, and that's still going. And then, as well as the Journal of Orgonomy, there is an Hours of the Institute of Orgonomic Science, which is still going. And then there was a journal that lasted about 10 years in the 80s called Offshoots of Orgonomy. And there's James DeMio's journal, which went up to about 2002 and hasn't been published since then. But there was 5 editions of that which were very good and comprehensive, called Pulse of the Planet. So there wasn't any journal in recent years that was publishing biophysical research and sort of new ground in orgonomy. So I think a few of the psychiatrists who are involved with other journals and work in orgonomy decided to set up Psychorgone, specifically Stefan Simonian. So we've got him to thank for having a new cutting-edge journal in orgonomy. So I've published a few. The first thing I published in orgonomy was my master's paper in about 2000. Well, it was finally published in 2002. I started it in 2000. I got an extra year for it because the statistics were so difficult. For a master's paper, it was really sort of it was a heck of a lot of work for a master's, and it was beyond the college. The private acupuncture college, and my supervisors. The statistics were too complex for them and for me. Bloody hard work, seeing as I don't even have a GCSE in maths. Anyway, I got help from a professor in Manchester University, and within a year we redid the statistics and it passed the MSc. And that was my first paper, looking at a comprehensive overview of orgonomy and how it relates to Chinese medicine. And it included a 72-person, double-blind, placebo-controlled, randomized study that showed to a confidence interval of 0.3, below the medical standard anyway, or above the medical standard, or whichever way you want to look at it, of 0.05, I think, or 0.5. Anyway, it's statistically significant evidence that orgone devices affect both sensation intensity and sensation area in acupuncture. So qi and orgone are probably the same thing. There was about 60 parallels between the theories of orgonomy and Chinese medicine. Not that Reich had any contact with Chinese theory. Anyway, so that takes us to this point in time, to Psychorgone, PSYCHORGONE.com. And if you go to the psychorgone.com, which is the online journal for orgonomy, and then click on orgone biophysics tabs, I think this paper will be the first one, or one of the ones that comes up, and this is, I've had published 4 papers on that site, and this is the first one, called Implications of Orgone for Consciousness Research Part 1, and pardon me, and but it's kind of an overview paper, a brief overview of the main theories used to explain consciousness. Right, I won't read that, I can put it better in my own words. What the paper first, it's kind of to bring you up to where orgone and consciousness meet. But before we can do that, we need to do a bit of background work. So this paper, the first one published in a journal by me on Orgone and consciousness, is mainly about the background work. Part 2 of this series looks at the practical implications for in things like artificial intelligence and stuff. But first off, it's got to get a good grip on the background. And one of the problems with consciousness studies is a lot of scientists have given up their background in philosophy. And science came from philosophy. Well, from religion to an extent as well. But giving up the philosophy background really disables science, because it's like it's like getting rid of your understanding of something and just looking at it completely raw. Philosophy gives you the background to connect the dots, as it were. So the scientists often don't connect the dots anymore. So this is why this paper really is mostly about philosophical background. Firstly, I define consciousness in the paper as in the philosophical way, which, if I hadn't studied philosophy, I wouldn't know there was a philosophical definition as opposed to sort of other definitions. But consciousness is herein defined as any and all subjective experience. So first off, I recap the main theories of consciousness. The first dominant theory of consciousness of the last century or so is materialism. Materialism has long roots, even though it is considered a modern theory. It actually goes back to ancient Greece. The atomist school of Greek philosophy, the most well-known proponent being Democritus, espoused the materialist view centuries before Christ. So materialism is no way a new thing. It's one of the oldest theories going, as is atomism. This theory, in its ancient and modern forms, views consciousness as a consequence of the movement of matter, and this is known as an epiphenomenal view. So consciousness is a phenomenon that comes from another phenomenon in the materialist view, hence epiphenomenal. So you've got the phenomenon of matter, and this dead, dumb matter that's got no life creates life, and life creates consciousness. So that there's heaps of contradictions in that statement, which are generally ignored. Now, I explore those later under the heading of problems of emergence, because if you've got dumb matter here, and then life emerges from it, that means life is either completely accidental, which is highly unlikely because the whole universe seems to be designed to incubate life, and if that dumb non-living matter accidentally creates life, then that means that there's a dualism that is impossible to solve, because dumb matter cannot be alive. Dumb, non-living, non-conscious matter cannot be alive. So if this dumb, non-conscious stuff makes something that is alive and then becomes conscious, let's bracket it together as alive and conscious, those two things cannot be reconciled. So you have, in any form of emergence theory, you have an irreconcilable dualism. So that's one of the problems of materialism. So the ancient atomist school of materialism saw mind as created by specialized mind atoms, Ancient atoms describe indestructible particles and not necessarily the same thing as modern atoms. Modern materialism views mind as the consequence of the action of neurons, chemicals and electricity in the brain and body. After the triumph of classical or Newtonian physics, and prior to the indeterminism of quantum theory, all matter was viewed as essentially predetermined, at least in theory. A mechanical universe was believed to have been set in motion by God, and then later by the Big Bang, which is just a God replacement theory in my mind. All material events could be predicted if one had complete knowledge of the physical forces present in the beginning. Consciousness is therefore merely an illusion produced in the brain by this predetermined movement of matter, a side effect or useful phantasm. So that consciousness as a side effect of the movement of matter is very problematic, because that means that we are all robots. So not many people accept this view. Only hardline materialists would seriously espouse this position with all its nonsensical implications, such as the lack of free will or volitional consciousness. According to the materialist philosophy, people are just evolving matter, and our consciousness will be entirely explained by material processes in the future. That's called promissory materialism. So it's just a theory that promises everything in the future and gives nothing in the present. Many scientists might accept the idea of an all-pervading mechanistic explanation called strong materialism when working in the laboratory, that all reality is just matter. But as concerns their private life, most believe that they have free will and conscious volition. They have ideas and choose to act upon them and are themselves more than a machine. This problem of strong materialism negating volition and will is called the philosophical zombie problem within philosophy. The well-known author and philosopher Dennett argues that a materialist explanation is not incompatible with free will and conscious volition. He says there is no hard problem in science, problem of explaining why there is subjective experience and how it arises. He argues that it will become clear in the future when it is understood how physical events explain consciousness. Well, I could just as easily have a promissory theory in the other way. I could say, well, consciousness will explain all physical events sometime in the future, just as strong as that theory. Critics characterise his approach as more of an avoidance of consciousness, as he sidesteps the thorny aspect of subjective experience, choosing to highlight easier processing issues instead. So yeah, the brain can process stuff, but it doesn't mean that it creates consciousness. The main argument against strong materialism in modern science is that qualia, conscious experiences, can be mapped onto physical processes, but cannot be reduced to them. However well a subjective experience is mapped onto an objective process, the two phenomena remain distinct. Materialism is not an explanation for consciousness so much as simply a denial of it. At best, materialism is a correlation to consciousness. Dennett's approach is simply to say qualia do not really matter. Qualia are just a consequence of a physical process, quite how it is not yet understood. Such a position contradicts most people's sense of experience reality. Unique qualia are central to experience. Dennett is not a strong materialist, however, as he does believe mental states have their own reality. Rather, he is a physicalist, someone who believes all mental processes can eventually be explained or reduced to physical processes. There is another position that's beyond that, kind of a super-materialism or a super-physicalism, where you say the physical actually is consciousness. But that gets into a deeper... I get to that much later in my later essays. And that's really Hegel's position. It's something called objective idealism, where you say, where you understand that the there isn't any such thing as physical and mental. There is only the conscious experiencing substance. But Dennett is still within the paradigm of that there's two things, physical and mental. But he calls himself a physicalist because he believes the mental will eventually be reduced to the physical. So he's a promissory physicalist. So the next set of theories that are popular for explaining consciousness are panpsychism. There is a set of theories that make logical sense regarding consciousness in this writer's view. As matter and consciousness are fundamentally different categories, there's no way to understand one category in terms of the other. A logical solution, rather than denial of one of the two categories, done outright or by subterfuge, is to fuse them. So one has matter that thinks, or alternatively thoughts that are material. This is the theory of panpsychism. I'm not sure if that's quite correct. This is a very early essay. That would be true of some forms of panpsychism, but a lot of forms of panpsychism still see matter and mind as being two different things, but that the universe always has, like if that's the universe, there's one side would be matter and one side would be mind. They always go together. But that's one position in panpsychism, and panpsychism is a very broad umbrella. So you could call my own views somewhat panpsychic, but I think because I don't view there is a separate psyche and a separate matter, that would be somewhere between panpsychism and objective idealism, so closer to Hegel really, probably. Anyway, I'm getting sidetracked a little bit. But all panpsychism, whatever flavour of panpsychism you come across, all of it believes that consciousness is fundamental to the universe. So that's the main difference between panpsychism and materialism, in that in materialism, consciousness is not fundamental. There was times in the universe when there was no consciousness, and consciousness then became emerged from material processes, which doesn't really make sense, because if consciousness is accidental, then materialism fails because it becomes dualism. And if consciousness is inherent to matter, materialism fails because then it's panpsychism. So materialism just cannot stand up as a philosophical theory. The only way materialism can stand up as a philosophical theory is if you say matter actually is consciousness. But even then it's virtually Hegelian idealism, or a kind of flavour of panpsychism. So it's on a hiding to nothing, really. So going back to panpsychism, if consciousness is fundamental, it cannot be explained in terms of something else. Such an explanatory position is logically impossible anyway. There is nothing outside of the phenomenon of consciousness with which to explain it. However, although the theories proposed by this writer, in common with other panpsychic theories, make consciousness a fundamental property, it is a property of a claimed real entity. So the Orgone panpsychic theory that I put forward says that there actually is a single physically real entity that is conscious. As Blasband observes, Richard Blasband is a Orgone researcher. The driving force behind Reich's work was to understand the nature of life. As a young man, he thoroughly read the work of the scientists and thinkers who had preceded him in this quest. He wrote, I am well aware that the human race has known about the existence of a universal energy related to life for many ages. However, the basic task of natural science consists in making this energy usable. This is the sole difference between my work and all preceding knowledge. So it's all very well saying the universe is panpsychic and consciousness is one energy, but show us that energy. I want to see it on a machine. I know that's offensive to some people who don't like machines, but so be it. If the energy is real, you can measure it. In the panpsychic approach, all matter is thought to possess consciousness to some degree. The British scientist Rupert Sheldrake illustrates the logic of panpsychism in detail in his book on freeing the scientific method from constraint by narrow materialist dogma. His experimental work on animal telepathy and in learning processes, the more people that learn something, the easier it is to learn it, may practically indicate the existence of consciousness fields. He has shown that chemical crystallization also reacts in this way to previous information elsewhere. A formerly difficult substance to crystallize will become easier to form once it is already formed somewhere else. He calls these processes formative causation, which acts through morphic resonance. His theories and arguments support a panpsychic approach to reality. The medieval alchemists certainly had a panpsychic vision with their concept of a universal mind. Many of the founding fathers of science, such as Newton, have also documented to privately hold panpsychic views of the universe, but did not always share these with the wider public. As with a lot of the great scientists, like Einstein in his later life believed in an ether, but believed in things like homeopathy having a valid mechanism. But the world's greatest materialist, Newton, wasn't a materialist, was a panpsychic, and this is revealed in, he believed in a universal mind, but he kept it quiet. And he was very interested in alchemy. And then who was the other great one? Newton, Darwin. Darwin eventually conceded that evolution didn't make sense without a higher power. So the materialists, all their founders don't believe in their theories. Every single great materialist has rejected materialism in one way or another. I mean, Darwin didn't believe in a god with a beard sitting on a cloud, creating. He did believe in gradual evolution, although he recognised it had problems, which it has a lot of. But he did eventually concede that there had to be a higher power for life to always proceed onwards and upwards. It couldn't be by accident, Darwin thought. Anyway, that's a tangent. To conclude our brief overview of materialism in consciousness research, the ideas of strong materialism are, in most scientists, either not thought through, so they've just not done their homework, or relegated to work only. Like the general public, most scientists, to some extent, privately believe in dualism. So dualism is the third theory that I examine in this paper in depth. Before strong materialism gained ascendancy as a theory of consciousness, dualism was the dominant theory of consciousness. Dualism was exemplified by René Descartes, 1596 to 1650, and lasted until the Enlightenment era of the 17th and 18th centuries, when industrialization of the environment led to its demise in our thinking. After the Industrial Revolution, people came to think of themselves as machines, just as today some regard themselves as computers. Prior to this period, Descartes was one of the most influential thinkers regarding consciousness, and his adage, popularly translated as "I think, therefore I am," is still influential today. Um, the French scientist declared that the only thing that can truly be known is that one is an experiencing entity. So, I mean, Descartes' main axiom still hasn't been disproved, what is it, 300 or 400 years later? 400 years later? He's the only thing that anyone can truly say for 100% certainty is that consciousness exists. I mean, all the other things that Descartes built on top of that foundation, like, I mean, you like he said, God exists because of consciousness. Well, he had various arguments that I can't think of offhand, but built on that central premise. But and some people say, well, yeah, the central premise is true, but you can't say that individual selves really exists. But a self must exist to experience things. I mean, whether there's just one self and one experience, and we're all a part of that, or there's many selves, no one knows. But all we know is that there is something that experiences. That's the only thing that can truly be known. So what one takes for a reality could be an illusion. I do have problems with viewing reality as an illusion, because even an illusion is real to some extent. It's a real experience, isn't it? So why say, oh, this your real experience day to day, well, that's an illusion. And when you go to heaven, that's real. They're just experiences. On the other hand, the fact that one experiences consciousness cannot be denied. Whether what is experienced is real or an illusion, it is still an experience. Descartes believed there are two realms, one of mind and one of matter, and the two interact through the pineal gland in the human brain. I mean, some people are trying to resurrect dualism today, and they're saying, well, I mean, dualism does have merits. It's honest. It does pretty much conform to how we experience a realm of the mind, we experience a realm of matter, and we're not quite sure how the two interact, but we think they do. Well, we know that they do. So dualism has got a fair bit going for it. He thought most animals were automata and lacked the connection to the higher realm, and mind and matter can be seen as two fundamentally different substances. Substances mean mode of reality in the philosophical sense. And the perfect physical substance for Descartes was God. So in some ways he was a Trinitarian, because he thought there was mind, one substance, matter, another substance, and God, the ultimate substance. The difficulty for dualism scientifically, I'll just have a look how much I've done, 33 minutes, so try and keep to under an hour. Right. The difficulty for dualism scientifically is that it is irreconcilable in practice. Dualism has mostly been rejected by the scientific community for this reason. Materialism is what is known as a monistic theory. In dualism, there are two fundamental substances or two realms. However, how do these two realms ever interact if they have nothing in common? No one has been able to answer this question, so that's why dualism is being quietly sidelined. So there's various explanations for how dualism might work. That one's called parallelism, that they forever parallel each other, but that doesn't actually have any scientific value, because you can't really prove it one way or another unless you know what enables the parallelism to take place. And if you know that, then it's no longer a dualist theory, really. And there's a religious theory for dualism that God enables mind and matter to parallel each other. But that's not been very popular amongst scientists either. Despite the great strides of materialism in the technological realm, most of the human race still believes in a higher power, and most people believe in a spiritual realm and view reality as a mixture of dualistic and materialistic processes. I may as well read you this quote from Professor Darwin. If you go to my essay and you look up reference 13, you'll find the, I think it's from, it's a conversations with famous scientists, and it's a conversation between Darwin and Tennyson. And Tennyson says, then you admit, Professor Darwin, that there is a higher power behind evolution. And Darwin says, certainly I admit it. I am compelled to do so, because evolution has always gone onward and upward, from lower to higher forms of life. That could not be chance. It is unscientific to postulate such a hypothesis, because chance never moves in one direction. Actually, I'll give you the reference, because it's a bit... Arthur Abel, Abell, talks with great composers. Chapter on conversation between Tennyson and Darwin, Haruki Publishing, Kindle edition, pp 28 to 30. So I've not covered a heck of a lot of this essay yet, so I'm going to have to get a move on. My next subsection is quantum consciousness theories. This posits that there's a couple of different types of quantum consciousness theories. There's one type posits that because quantum physics implies that there is indeterminacy in the material world, consciousness could thereby impose itself on physical reality through quantum events. And some people note that because consciousness seems to have an effect on quantum experiments, that consciousness must somehow be part of the underlying unity of the universe. So that's the monistic approach in quantum consciousness theories. Yeah. However, there are also many. There's a dualistic quantum approach where quantum processes are thought to be the material correlation of consciousness. So, but it's still not saying that those material events actually are consciousness themselves. So that's a dualistic quantum approach. And then there's the monistic quantum approach. However, which I'll read you from my essay. However, there are also many monistic approaches. The observer effect in quantum physics, that measurement affects outcome, and non-local behaviour of particles is thought to indicate a universal substratum, which many think might be synonymous with consciousness. So I mentioned McTaggart, Hume, Bohm, Jung, Pauli, and various people. It would loosely correspond to this writer's view of Orgone at its most basic level, being a consciousness, or you could call it dual aspect thinking, which is a form of monism, because mind and matter are two aspects of a third all-encompassing entity. Dual aspect theories could be argued to be compatible with the panpsychic approach. Like some people criticise panpsychism as really being dualism in disguise. And there is a form of quantum theories which call themselves dual aspect theories. They say the universe is a third thing, and one aspect can be matter, or presents as matter, and one presents as mind. But I think that's not going far enough. That's like sniffing the apple but not biting it, really. And then we go on to systems theories. They're probably the most modern set of theories regarding consciousness, which says that non-living material forces some point coalesce into the emergent property of life through random processes, and then living systems themselves then undergo further processes to become consciousness. I've got a graph here. So you've got the material realm. There is an emergence into the animal realm, where perception evolves, and then there is another emergence from that realm into self-consciousness. And then I say that this is also a problematic explanation for consciousness. Firstly, it is dualistic, which I've already outlined, because a new realm of functioning that is entirely separate emerges out of a separate mechanical realm purely by chance. So that can't be a monistic theory, it's got to be a dualistic theory, and dualism fails. Well, there is a positive, I shouldn't be so harsh on dualism, there is positive aspects to dualism. After the soft dualism, I can agree with, that there's two aspects that come from the underlying unity. After the material realm has randomly initiated the animal realm, which evolves into self-consciousness, how do they interact if they have nothing in common? And if matter, animal life and consciousness do share commonality, doesn't that support the theory of panpsychism rather than emergence? Panpsychism would, unlike most system theories, posit the universe and everything in it is consciousness. And also from an orgonomic point of view, the material world cannot help but create life, because all material processes can easily create the tiny living vesicles that Reich found, called the bions, which are about the size of a clump of viruses. It was the bions that actually led to the discovery of Orgone. It was a bion radiation that led to the discovery of life force. So some may try and so the emergence theory also hinges on chance, and this chance factor is ruled out because the universe appears to be perfectly set for life and thus consciousness in terms of its physical parameters. Some may try and get around this by saying that there are multiple universes and this one just happens to be perfect for life and consciousness to manifest by chance, but there's no scientific evidence of that, of multiple universes. Positing near infinite universes without evidence is violation of Occam's law, not to multiply entities unnecessarily. On the other hand, there is abundant evidence that the cosmic parameters of the universe are perfectly set for life and consciousness to appear. This is known as the fine-tuning argument, and is explored to some extent by Sheldrake in the Science Delusion. For example, if any of the more than 40 precisely set cosmic physical parameters were even minutely different, complex matter and thus life would not have arisen. So I think the fine-tuning parameters of the physical universe reflect that there is one life force, Orgone. Right, I won't read out all of this, there's quite a lot of in there. So Reich's theories of consciousness are not orgonomic, they were a form of system theory, because Reich believed that you had non-conscious, non-living, which is a contradiction for a life force, which Reich didn't have time to explore this. He would have done had he not been cut off before his work came to complete fruition. But Reich, in about 1950s, before his kind of spiritual awakening in prison, and at the end of the Orgone process from about 1950 to 57, he thought consciousness, he thought the creation of consciousness was due to a non-conscious, non-living energy in the cosmos, and then that energy got encircled by a biological membrane and became living perceptive energy, and then those units came together, perceptive units, to create a self-conscious entity. So that's a system theory, because consciousness arises from a system, and as I explore in the essay, systems theories have a number of problems. The best that can be hoped from systems theories in this writer's view is that they describe the mechanics of a panpsychic universe. And the reason system theories are problematic is because consciousness is either an epiphenomena in such views, or there is an irreconcilable dualism. Then we go on to neurological theories, and I argue that these are problematic too, because they're only correlation. However well you correlate a thought process, it's only a correlation, it's not that actually thought. I'll just read you the last bit of it. Neurology often uses analogies of a computer when looking at the brain and the assumed creation of consciousness which is assigned to it. Neurology cannot locate the physical position of a single memory, much less the home of self or consciousness. It's admitting now that memory, consciousness, various functions are kind of like cloud functions, that they see a cloud in the brain that corresponds to various stuff, but they can't find an individual memory storage unit like in a computer. Claiming memory is distributed is the same as saying it is a field function and not locally stored at all. So like a radio could have like bits of its circuitry light up when it downloads various information. Shut up, birds! Sorry, I've got parakeets and they're rather annoying. Right, I'm going to have to put something over you parakeets if you're not quiet. Right, so memory located field stores. A brain and computer are entirely dissimilar. A computer stores memories as discrete material changes in a single location. A brain doesn't. A computer carries out functions by opening and closing single gates. A brain doesn't. It works as an integrated whole, although they're trying to change that in computers. The whole human as machine and brain as computer analogies have had their day, in my opinion. A human is an organism and a brain is an organism within an organism. So an organism is a holistic thing. It's not a machine. Machines are created by something outside and they do a function that their creator assigns. They're not holistic in themselves. If the brain were a computer and a mind its effect, it would be a lot of things that have been found in neurology, say like some people who have normal functioning but have most of their brain missing, would be unexplainable. So this brings us to holistic areas, holistic theories, and I won't go into this in detail, but there's a problem with holistic theories as well, because they say, well, everything is one, mind and matter, quantum effects, material effects, it's all one and it's all conscious, but we don't know why. So that's why orgonomy is I don't want to use this word because it's a bit negative, but it's the killer app in consciousness, because orgonomy says, yeah, there is a single continuum in the universe, and hey, we can measure it. And so if you're saying there is a holistic consciousness and it includes everything, then with orgonomy you can actually measure that energy. And not just say, oh, it's an effect of electricity, but a lot of psychic things that are beyond electricity, or still occur when you have a Faraday cage around them, which is actually an orgone cabinet anyway, which a lot of psychic researchers have yet to take on board. Apart from Tiller, William Tiller, he's had probably the strongest evidence of consciousness affecting matter directly from Stanford University. He imprinted electronic storage devices with consciousness intent, and then from very strong meditators, and then used these devices to affect biological samples in specific ways. But I think, well, I know for a fact from other books that he was aware of orgonomy, and I'm pretty certain he used an orgone effect in his experiments. Anyway, so I'm getting towards an hour, so I need to quicken this up a bit. So in summary, I mark out that all the main scientific theories of consciousness are problematic. Materialism, dualism, system theories, and holistic theories all have various problems. And then I ask, has pure philosophy done any better? And I look at idealism. Idealism also has problems. I go into it in more detail in other essays, but idealism doesn't explain why there is different levels of material or different levels of reality. Like some realities are very dense and some realities are very dreamlike. But just to say that everything is a dream, well, if everything is a dream, then you don't need to look both ways when you cross the road, but you do. So why is material reality so dense? Oh, it's just the way consciousness works here. Well, that tells you nothing, does it? A philosophical friend of mine, he's actually a qualified philosopher and what do you call it when someone is a theologian, a theologian and professional philosopher, and his focus is on orgonomy, and he calls idealism a theory of minimal explanation. Stephen Katz is his name, K-A-T-Z. He's got both a blog post, various books, and a radio show. Then I next explore Reich's theories of consciousness in some detail, and this, which I'm going to have to go through quickly. The central problem with Reich's theories of consciousness is he didn't separate consciousness and emotion. So he explained how emotion leads to different types of perception, energy in motion, but he didn't really have an explanation for consciousness apart from his system theory of like non-conscious orgone, membrane, perception, lots of perceptive units banding together to form a conscious, self-conscious self. So Reich's theory of consciousness was actually a materialist system theory. I've got a diagram here. So you've got a source of biological energy, common functioning principle diagram, and the source of biological energy is not conscious in Reich's early view, before he had his kind of spiritual awakening. And then you've got an identity of psyche and soma, or mind and body, and then that splits into body and mind. So Reich had a good understanding of how body and mind relate, and he had a good understanding of how contraction of energy causes pain and expansion of energy causes pleasure. But he failed to see that the actual biological energy without a membrane, without being materially changed, is itself conscious. So he was forced to take a Darwinian view of consciousness as an evolutionary epiphenomena. So So a couple of quotes that illustrate this. Biological laws from Reich. Biological laws can apply in the psychic realm, but the converse is not true. The common factor cannot be meaning, nor can it be purpose. These are secondary functions. From a consistent functional point of view, there is in the biological realm no purpose, no aim, only functioning and development following certain laws. So I criticised that, saying that that could have been written by Charles Darwin, really. But Reich did change later on, I think, when he had his spiritual awakening. But Organomic Functionalism as a method of inquiry, as Reich used it in the 40s and early 50s, early 50s, cannot explain consciousness, because consciousness remains an epiphenomena in those theories. And there's also another problem that Reich notes himself. Reich stated, "We generally assume that functioning precedes and induces structural developments of organs and not the other way round. Whatever the answer to this riddle may turn out to be, man slowly began to reason beyond his strong organotic contact." So Reich notes that his theory of armouring has a few problems, because Reich usually supposes that the function that is in the orgone itself precedes the form that the orgone takes, whereas Reich recognises that his theory of consciousness puts form first, like the membrane comes round the bion and then perception arises in that little unit of life. But Reich had failed to find a theory of why armouring occurs. He mapped out its mechanics, but he couldn't find why it occurred. So he eventually thought that it was some kind of system error, really. That the consciousness began to look at itself and freaked out and thought, what the hell's going on? So he didn't really understand why armouring was occurring. It's quite involved. The subsection on armouring is quite a deep one, and I can't really sum it up in a couple of sentences. But it hinges around this problem of why humans became armoured rather than other animals to the same degree, and also hinges around the problem of why consciousness should go wrong. So there's Reich also unintentionally implies that only human societies that go on to become armoured are prone to deep self-reflections. Reich's ideas have an additional unforeseen characteristic. If self-consciousness is a consequence of the development of cosmic orgone into biological energy, and from there into part perceptions, and eventually to full self-consciousness, why should that process cause anything unnatural? Armouring should therefore be as natural as being unarmoured, if Reich is correct in his causative hypothesis. So there's a whole load of problems with consciousness and armouring. Not that I would in any way deny that armouring isn't a correct theory, but it's just as a philosophical theory. Where did the armouring come from originally? That it has a few problems. And then I look at problems in terms of therapy, because in orgone psychiatric therapy, it's known that the body is conscious, and it's known that movements of the orgone produce various changes in consciousness. So if the orgone is the carrier of consciousness, how comes orgone in the atmosphere is non-conscious? It doesn't really make sense. And then I talk about consciousness outside of organisms, I talk a little bit about the Turing test and the problems with that, and a kind of propose a better Turing test that I've called the pet dog test. Well, I haven't called it in this essay, but you'll get what I mean if you read the essay. And then I talk about how a number of scientists are beginning to explore panpsychism, including physicists and cosmologists. I mean, especially physicists, because physicists are beginning to see how perfectly tuned the universe is for life and consciousness to emerge, so that they were among the first scientists to move towards a panpsychic view, because they were the first to realise that materialism doesn't really make sense. I talk a little bit about, wonder if I got time just to read the conclusion. Yeah, I'll just read the conclusion. A number of scientists are beginning to espouse panpsychism, including physicists and cosmologists such as Holton Arp, and of course the biologist Rupert Sheldrake in his various books. The theory of panpsychism does not deny that material reality exists, but it states that this material reality is itself alive and capable of experiencing consciousness. It unifies the realms of matter, energy and consciousness. The orgonomic theory of consciousness I have outlined elsewhere is panpsychic and monistic in nature, which I call the Orgone Continuum. It could be classified as orgonotic panpsychism. I've now changed that a wee bit. In this theory, it's proposed that Orgone itself does, counter to what Reich said in his discussion of Freud's death drive, actually independently possess consciousness. Further, that from this orgonotic consciousness arises the energetic and material functions of Orgone. Orgone and consciousness become identical at the deepest level, just as energy or matter is identical to consciousness in Sheldrake's panpsychism. Orgone only gains differentiation at more superficial levels, which is experienced as orgone energy, and lastly as matter, which is a form of frozen orgone energy. Thus there is a monistic continuum in a triad from orgonotic consciousness to orgone energy and lastly to orgone matter. This monistic continuum has three distinct aspects: orgone consciousness, orgone energy and orgone matter. All three are physical and all three are real, but the consciousness level could be said to be the most real, or the primary reality. Orgone energy and matter are specialised forms of a physical orgonotic consciousness in this view. Energy and matter still exist in their own right, but are not separate to consciousness. Reich's theories of the integration of part perceptions into self-consciousness and of the relation of the pleasure-pain antithesis to energy and motion are useful, but nevertheless fail to comprehend consciousness. Alternatively, if orgone is considered to be conscious in itself, as well as embracing a logically consistent theory of consciousness, panpsychism, interesting technological possibilities might be presented. It could help make a consciousness field usable in a scientific sense, because orgone is a real tangible field and not a hypothetical construct or merely an idea of a universal field. These possibilities are explored in the second part of this series. Okie dokie. So that's it. Thank you for watching, and I hope it's been of some value to you. And I shall see. I've never done a live video before. Last time I did I recorded and uploaded, and it took me 2 days to upload the video. So that's why I've done it live this time. But I'm not sure how to end the live recording. I think it's this one. Hopefully this one doesn't delete the whole video. But anyway, I shall press it.